Women on Boards was in fact founded back in 2006. So some nearly 17 years ago. It came out of a movement after the Sydney Olympic Games, which, if we can all believe it, were held nearly 23 years ago. I know, it's amazing. I was at the Kathy Freeman final, and I can still vividly recall the atmosphere in that stadium. Anyway, women did particularly well at that games, but there were very few women in leadership and board roles. And so Catherine Ordway, who happened to be and still is an expert around anti-doping and does a lot of consultation. She's a lawyer who does a lot of consultation to the sports bodies. She and Ruth Medd have had a cup of coffee one day in Sydney somewhere, and they decided that they should do something about this. And Ruth happened to be on the board of the National Foundation for Australian Women, which still is still going strong. And it was one of the sort of auspicing bodies, I suppose, that had been set up many, many years ago to start to, I suppose, be very proactive in how you start to get the women's agenda into government policy and at the higher level. It was spearheaded by somebody called Mari Coleman, who was the first woman to ever head a government department in Australia when she was appointed by Gough Whitlam to head family and communities. It all started off that way. A grant was got from the government, the only one we've ever had really, in about 2003. And so I met Ruth 20 years ago. And because I was on the board of a agricultural body, I was quite young then, and they needed somebody there. And so it started off nascent movement as a sort of a way to connect people through to board roles, way to connect women to those who are on the radar, those who had the gift of putting them on the radar. So that was Ruth and I, a little bit younger. And we did a lot of that early heavy lifting, I suppose. Liz Broderick came to the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's role in 2007. So there was quite a lot of, movement there. The ASX was still largely very recalcitrant about the issue of moving women into board roles. I did my Churchill Fellowship in 2011. I got it in 2010, and I did it in 2011. And I'd had several trips to Norway so I knew a lot about quota law. And of course, over here, we were very unkeen on quota law. So we started to do things like change the corporate governance principles and guidelines. And that was part of the process of really starting to shift the way that we were thinking about women on board roles. So when we started, there was 7 or 8% women on the ASX 200. So, there's now plus 30% on that, sort of nearly. And none of the other sectors were being measured. Nobody was really doing much on it. So we had the great opportunity to sort of be Mavericks Incorporated and really be quite tough about the whole issue. Fast forward to 2010 to 2012, and then we partnered with those 3 women in the UK. And I travelled over there on the back of my Churchill Fellowship, and we set up Women on Boards in the UK, and it is still going strong. So why did Ruth and I do it? We really did it because we could see that the agenda needed changing. And we thought, right, we're a small group. So how can we actually do that? Well, what we can actually do is we can start to influence the number of women who are sitting on at the decision-making level, at the strategy setting, on the strategy bodies for all organisations. And if we do that everywhere, if we do that in government, we do it in the ASX, we do it in the private sector, we do it in the non-profit sector, we do it across all of the sectors, that can be kind of our contribution to having the trickle-down impact that you need to start to really shift change. Our agenda was always 40% women on board and in leadership roles, has been for years. And we got that actually out of the Norwegian quota law, which is a 40-40-20 quota law, which is 40% men, 40% women, and of 20% of any other gender, either or any other gender. But did you know in Norway it is just as illegal to have more than 60% women on a board as it is to have 60% men on the board? So it was never in fact the women's quota. It was in fact just a quota law. How did we go? Well, we needed to establish a baseline, and there was quite a few companies, like all the sort of major consulting companies and the big 4, who were producing reports, but the reports were aggregated. So the data was aggregated. So you didn't get a lot of granularity in terms of what organisations are doing well and what organisations weren't. So we set up the Boardroom Diversity Index in 2010, and we, through a laborious process, started to track and measure the number of women on boards across a whole range of sectors. Now, we don't just focus on the ASX 200. There's 1,560 directors on the ASX 200. You know, how many people live in this country? There's university boards, there's superannuation, there's government, there's so many other sectors. There's the startup sector, the ethics space, you know, there's subsidiaries, there's trusts, there's foundations, there's so many different areas that people can lend their expertise and talents and still make an equal contribution. So we focused on broadening it out beyond the ASX. And interestingly, since we've started in sport and all sorts of other things, many sectors have achieved 40% except the ASX and possibly private boards, because private boards, of course, are very hard to measure. And in 2020, we did it for 10 years. We measured 1,385 boards. 702 had reached or exceeded the 40% target. So that's a little more than half. The ones that are really bad are the ASX the ASX 200 plus. So the rest of the All Ordinaries up to the 500 and then past that. And that's really where everybody's attention needs to focus. There's a lot of indices published by, you know, leading organizations around the ASX 200. I'm like, you know, why don't you challenge yourself, guys, to do something difficult, because where it's harder is in the ASX 200 plus, much harder. The ASX 200 is going to get to 40%. We could quota that tomorrow, it wouldn't be a problem. Beyond that is where you have difficulties. So 2022 snapshot, ASX 200 companies, as I said, they're at 36%. That's a pretty good number. They're not far off of 40%. And on the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, which we of course fought very hard to bring in under the Gillard government, which gave us teeth in terms of gender reporting. 34% of board members of the reporting organisations are female, but that picks up any organisation with more than 100 people working for it. So that picks up a lot of that private sector. So that's where you start to get some of this movement. The upshot is there's still work to be done to achieve 40% gender balance, and we've added cultural diversity within board and a leadership role. So just as we really sought to shine a light on the fact that women were not on the radar of those who were doing the looking back in the sort of, you know, 2006 onwards. And what we were trying to do was to say to companies, you know, turn off the spotlight and turn on the floodlight, because if you turn off the spotlight where you only see people you know, people that who you know, who others know, and you actually turn on the floodlight, you can see people who can lay equal claim to any role sitting at the edge of that circle. And that's what WOB did. What WOB was really successful in doing was shining a light on all of those people sitting at the edge of that circle, who didn't know enough people to get on the radar of those who were doing the appointments, but who actually could add enormous value to those boards. That's a statue that was produced, or a freeform statue that was produced by an artist for our 10th birthday. And she said at the time, she said, describe WOB to me. And of course I started talking about WOB. She said, no, I'm an artist, I'm a simple soul. She said, tell me. I said, fine. Woman you are, woman you were, woman whom you will become, existing and working within a circle of a reciprocity. You have a hand up and a hand down. And that has always been a core tenet of what we do. And so I've always loved that, because it's always been a lovely visual representation of how WOB works. We seek to impact, influence and inspire women to do what they do best. And we don't seek to own or control, but we walk alongside you.